Hello everyone, welcome to Faith-Wise Defenders. My name is Nathan Faust, and I want to welcome you to this journey where we're going to be talking a little bit about, is Jesus a myth? I know some of you are probably sitting there thinking, what on earth is he talking about? Yes, there are individuals, and it's really being force-fed down people's throats, especially on social media, by elite professors, elite liberal professors. The idea that the Bible is a bunch of myths, and of course, Jesus is a myth. Even though that guys like N.T. Wright, Dr. N.T. Wright, Dr. Michael Bird, and so on and so forth say things like, you would have a better job disproving Caesar, one of the Caesars, than disproving that Jesus was an actual historical figure. That is how much evidence Jesus has in his favor. And that's something that we Christians need to take complete and utter joy in, to know that Jesus has that much evidence backing him up. Now, before I share my screen and take away my face, there are three basic lines of evidence that proves, that apologists usually use to prove in the historical authenticity of Jesus Christ. The first line of evidence is literature, and that's where we're going to be really anchoring in this video, is looking at some of the historical literature. The second are eyewitnesses. Jesus was seen by eyewitnesses, and they wrote about him. We see that in Scripture. And number three, artifacts. I don't know what you guys may think about the Shroud of Turin, but I would love to weigh in on that in a future video, and I'm going to. It's a very interesting, and I think it's very powerful artifact for sure. But those are the three types of evidences: literature, historical literature like Tacitus and so forth, eyewitness testimony, the gospel and the gospels, and artifacts. Those are usually what apologists use to give a defense in this area. We're going to focus on the first two in this video, and I hope to cover the Shroud of Turin in another video. So let's go ahead and get to it. The first is Jesus a myth. Let me share my screen. There we go. Is Jesus a myth? Now, what do mythicists believe? They believe that Jesus does not exist. They believe that there is no hard evidence proving that he ever existed on the planet. Now, some, depending on who you see, depending on who you read or listen to, they sometimes say that Jesus is a borrowed character. Now, what do I mean by that? Is that he's an amalgamation of different characters, of different individuals. He's like a soup, if you will. Like, for example, you cut up the potatoes and you have a buffet of individuals contained in one person. That's simply not the case. Number two, people say there's absence of contemporary sources. That's not the case. We'll be proving that statement false. Parallels with pagan myths. Interesting, right? I'm thinking of Romulus. I'm thinking of Osiris. I'm thinking about Horus and Dionysius. Those four are commonly compared to Jesus and saying that Jesus borrowed from or stole from these individuals. But if you read their stories, if you read their mythologies, if you actually buckle down and do your research like a good boy and a good girl supposed to do, you'll find that there are no parallels whatsoever. And if there are parallels, there are universal parallels. Like, for example, universal truths. Well, obviously that's the case because that's universally true, and so on and so forth. And for example, in my comparative classes that one does in their master's degrees, in their graduate programs, comparing Buddhism and Christianity side by side each other, there are a lot of universal truths that Christianity and Buddhism share, but they're also vastly different. And that's the same thing with these pagan mythologies. And a lot of the similarities, one might say, depends upon the culture which those myths originated from as well. So that will be an entirely different video coming up. But we disproved the similarity between Jesus and Romulus, and we disproved the similarity between Jesus and Osiris. With Romulus, according to Plutarch, was born through natural means, through relations, through intercourse. Plutarch says that his mother was raped. She believed it was by a god, by Mars. Plutarch says probably some other guy, probably just some random guy. So that in of itself is a dissimilarity between Christianity, between Jesus and Romulus right off the bat. So comparing those two, I'm not really seeing the similarities between that. They also say, the mythicists say, that there is a silence among Jewish sources. There is a deep silence among the sources that are Jewish about Jesus Christ. That's not the case, because we know the Talmud speaks about Jesus. So that's false. And they also point to the evolution of Christology. Now, this is really big among secular historians, secular biblical scholars. And yes, there are secular biblical scholars. That's an oxymoron if you ask me. But liberals would say that if you compare the Christology from Mark, knowing that Mark is the first gospel written, and you compare that and lay them side by side with the other synoptic gospels and John, you will know an evolution of the divinity of Jesus. They say things like, Mark, in the synoptic gospels, there's nothing about the divinity of Jesus. But when you go to John, we have divinity sayings right after the other. It's filled, it's jam-packed with the divinity of Jesus. That's not the case, because we look through Matthew chapter 14, verse 33, Jesus receives worship. We see in Mark chapter 2, verse number 5, that Jesus forgives sins. Now, what's so substantial about those two examples? Well, it's substantial in the fact that only God can receive worship. God the Father. And only God the Father has the right to forgive sins. So in that moment, Jesus, let's take Matthew 14:33 for an example. People worshiping him. Jesus could have done what the angels in the past did. Jesus could have done what the Apostle Paul or the Apostle Peter, I should say, did when in Acts chapter 10, when they fell before him and wanted to worship him. I believe that's Acts 10, verse 25 and verse 26. And Peter said, no, get up. I'm just a man like you. Jesus could have done that, but he didn't do it. Thus, pointing towards his divinity. And yes, the Synoptic Gospels do point to the divinity of Jesus. I'm sorry, Dr. Ehrman. I'm sorry, Dr. James Tabor, but that's the case. So here's a few problems with this mythicist view. There are valuable historical sources pointing toward the historical Jesus. We're about to get into those. And right now, Flavius Josephus. Now, some of these names are going to be pretty hard, even for a guy who's kind of have degrees in this. I would suspect I would be better at saying these names by now, but they're still hard. Flavius Josephus. He was a historian, 37 to 100 AD. His works are the Jewish War, 75 AD, and the Jewish Antiquities, 93 to 94 AD. I have a humongous book in my library about the works of Josephus that was given to me by a minister, an elderly minister in the area when I was younger. Fabulous read. But I want you to understand one thing about this, about the individuals that we're about to mention. These guys are top notch. These guys were the professionals in their era. Simple as that. This is what he wrote about Jesus. Now, there was about this time, Jesus, a wise man. I hope you're reading along with me. If it be lawful to call him a man. Now, that's an interesting statement, isn't it? For he was a doer of wonderful works. Okay, so Josephus is automatically admitting the miracles that Jesus did. We get two things right from the gate. Number one, Jesus was authentic. He was real. Here's a guy who's writing about him. And number two, wonderful works. He believed in the miracles that Jesus did. A teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. So he's saying he was Messiah. He was the one. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the third day. So he also gives record about the resurrection. This is such a powerful, powerful testimony, a powerful source of historical information. We see from Josephus that Jesus was a man, a God-man. Because it says lawful to call him a man. He was a doer of wonderful works. He was crucified on the cross, and he rose again the third day. And the divine prophets, not all, now watch this. Remember that series that we did in the shorts video not too long ago about the prophecies in the Old Testament and them being fulfilled in the New Testament? Well, here we go. Josephus says, yeah, that's right. As the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. Makes you think about that little passage toward the end of John, doesn't it? And the tribe of Christians so named from him are not extinct at this day. That is powerful, powerful history right there, my friends. And that comes from a wonderful historian from 37 to 100 AD. Now, why am I going back here and showing you this year? Because if we go all the way back to our second slide or so, the mythicists say that there's no contemporary sources, right? There's nobody around that time period that wrote about him. Well, here you go. Josephus, 37 to 100 AD. Simple as that. We also know that Josephus wrote about James as well. And he talks about Jesus in here too. Let's go down here where it says Festus. Festus was now dead. Albinus was but upon the road. So he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. Now, what's so great about this? Jesus. He mentions Jesus again. He also mentions that Jesus had a brother who was named James. Now we get into our second literary historical evidence, Tacitus. Life, 56 to 100 AD. We just keep proving that statement wrong, don't we? There's no contemporary sources that are really of any historical value. He was a historian and politician. Again, leading credit to the fact that these men knew what they were doing. This is a very, very simple way to provide this evidence. This is actually really simple to do with someone. All right, so Tacitus spoke of Jesus. He talks, of course, about Nero substituting the culprits. We'll start here. Nero substituted as culprits, talking about the persecution of Christians. Nero substituted as culprits and punished in the most exquisitely torturing ways those people, the people who believed, whom detested for their abominations, the crowd styled Christians. Christos, interesting, isn't it? The founder of the name had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius. Now, doesn't that sound very similar, very familiar of what we read in the New Testament? By sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilatus. And the pernicious substitution was checked for a moment, only to break out once more, not merely in Judea, the home of the disease, but in the capital itself, where all things horrible or shameful in the world collect and find a vogue. So, Tacitus speaks of Jesus. Suetonius speaks of Jesus. His life, 69 to 122 AD, a Roman historian and a biographer. Secretary to the Emperor Hadrian. Now, let me ask you something about this. Would this emperor hire anyone but the best? No. Simply not the case. And there's his works, the works of the 12 Caesars, and I'm not sure if I said this before, but what's interesting is this, a little interesting tidbit of information. You'll find, as we progress through this video, and if you do your own research, that Jesus has more information, more historical information backing him up than any of the Caesars. In fact, N.T. Wright would say that you will have a better chance disproving one of them than Jesus himself. So, Suetonius says, since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Christos, he, Claudius, expelled them from Rome. Life of Claudius, 25:4. Interesting. Now we go on to Secundus. I just usually write down their last name, or Plinius. He's also called Pliny the Younger. Pliny. So I usually just use Pliny or Secundus whenever I'm writing out my notes. He was born into a wealthy and influential family in modern-day Como in northern Italy. He received a comprehensive education in rhetoric, literature, and philosophy in Rome. His career was in Roman politics. He held various positions, including serving as a senator and holding several legal and administrative roles. Under the Emperor Domitian, he served as a prosecutor. This is what he says. They affirmed, however, that the whole of their guilt or their error was that they were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day. He's talking about the worship of the Christians here, before it was light, when they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ as to a God, and bound themselves by a solemn oath not to any wicked deeds, but never to commit any fraud, theft, or adultery, never to falsify their word, nor deny a trust when they should be called upon to deliver it up. After which it was their custom to separate, and then reassemble to partake of food, but food of an ordinary and innocent kind. So, here again, alluding to Christ, alluding to Jesus Christ. Next, we have Merabar Serapion. That's a fun word to say, isn't it? Syriac philosopher. He says, what advantage did the Athenians gain from putting Socrates to death? Famine and plague came upon them as judgment for their crime. What advantage did the men of Samos gain from burning Pythagoras? In a moment their land was covered with sand. What advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? Now that's powerful, isn't it? It was just after that their kingdom was abolished. That's true. God justly avenged these three wise men. Interesting, isn't it? Interesting. James the Just, the brother of Jesus. Now, those are the common secular sources. Now we come more towards biblical sources. James, the Lord's brother. Now, before you give anyone this type of information, know that it's possible that individuals will be turned off immediately when you mention that these are biblical sources coming up. So what I usually like to do is just give these secular sources first. Test the waters with that. And then if their hearts are softened, then you can spring these next examples. James talks about Jesus. James 1:1-1. The Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, what about Jesus? They were eyewitnesses. Paul, and of course, was a Pharisee who had great levels of education. He talks about Jesus. And of course, in conclusion, it would be ignorant to refuse the substantial evidence that is provided for Jesus Christ. That was an interesting video presentation, and whew, I survived all those names. I thought I was going to trip up on some, and I probably did. But anyway, I'm not really good at those types of names. But anyway, the main point is this. There's a substantial amount of evidence pointing toward Jesus Christ. I hope this video finds you well, my friend. In the coming days, there's going to be more videos like these. We're going to be getting into more Christian philosophy. We're going to get into more biblical studies. We're going to get more into theology and so on and so forth, and help equip the saints so that everyone can be prepared to give an answer. Jesus loves you. Jesus saves. Believe in Him today.